Have you ever played a game that you desperately wanted to love but just couldn't? One that had an extremely compelling concept, a unique and exciting style of gameplay, or even just sounded like it should be a ton of fun, but at the end of the day, it just didn't work? For me, that game is Dark Darker Darkest. My experience with this game started with my brother and I walking into a local game store while we were on vacation. We had money to burn and all the time in the world to play board games that week. We were determined to try something new and exciting. I went with the safe option and bought Unstable Unicorns. It was a game that had won several awards, had glowing reviews, and was from the same company that had made Happy Little Dinosaurs, one of my all-time favorite casual card games to bring to family events. My brother, on the other hand, went for something different. He wandered over to the co-op section, and, being a fan of games like Resident Evil, was immediately drawn to the box art of a certain game, Dark Darker Darkest, a self-proclaimed co-op horror survival game. Neither of us had heard of it, but it looked awesome. It came in a sturdy box with quality printing. The back of the box showed a game reminiscent of Betrayal at House on the Hill, so what could go wrong? And so, on a whim, he bought it, shelling out the $50 asking price, which seemed reasonable at the time. And that's when the horror truly began. Dark Darker Darkest is a cooperative survival horror board game made by Queen Games and released in 2014 after a successful Kickstarter campaign. It draws heavy inspiration from video games like Resident Evil and board games like Betrayal at House on the Hill. The game sees 2 to 5 players enter the rundown mansion of Dr. Mortimer, an evil scientist who holds the cure for a zombie virus that has brought about the apocalypse. Players will need to explore the house and battle hordes of zombies while trying to scavenge for supplies and locate the codes to unlock the laboratory, retrieve the cure, and face the final boss of the game. Now, this all sounds great on paper, doesn't it? For those of you in a hurry and just looking for a quick recommendation on whether or not to buy this game, I'll say this. Dark Darker Darkest is an inherently flawed game, but there is some fun to be had. If you want to try this game, I highly recommend playing with house rules to modify some of the more unbalanced or outright unfair parts of the game, and I'll even be putting my own recommendations for some of these changes in the video's description. I also can't say I'd recommend the game at full price, but if you find the game for cheap and don't mind putting in the work to design it into an experience you want to play, then give it a try. So, it's a no with an asterisk. Let's get into what the gameplay actually looks like. Each player will assume the role of 1 of 5 survivors, each with their own set of abilities available to them. They'll each start with 1 and have 4 others that they'll be able to unlock. Each survivor comes with a corresponding information board showing their stats and abilities and a unique miniature to represent them on the game board. And speaking of the game board, this game follows a similar model to Betrayal at House on the Hill, where it will have you build a unique board out of a variety of room tiles for each playthrough, with some necessary consistency with certain game crucial elements, such as the 4 corner rooms of the house. Inside the box, you'll also find a deck of equipment cards, a huge variety of tiles and tokens, and a couple of additional boards. This board is the security board. This represents the lock on Mortimer's lab, which will be given a unique code as part of the setup, and will be opened by a series of code tiles collected throughout the mansion. The second one is the multi-tracker board, which is central to this game's overall approach to gameplay. The multi-tracker is essentially what players will use to track their character's actions throughout each turn, as well as the progression of time throughout the entire game. I won't go into detail on what every single icon means, but I will tell you that the icons on the left represent various events that will trigger on each turn. The numbers on the bottom represent the progression of the darkness, where players will lose if the tracker reaches 5 before they complete their goal, and the grid in the center represents the group up mechanic, which I'll discuss in more detail later. Now, just talking quality of the physical game pieces, I'll admit I was pretty impressed. The printings on all the cards and tiles look great, and all of the included miniatures look amazing as well. I also really appreciated that they included several Ziploc bags for holding all the tokens that you'll punch out as part of your first time setup. It's a small thing, but I appreciate it. It's just unfortunate they put more thought into that than the gameplay. As I said before, the ultimate goal of the game is to enter Dr. Mortimer's lab. The way you'll be doing that is by opening the various locked rooms around the mansion, because, as you'll notice, the flip side of every lock token has a set of colored icons that match the ones that appear on the security board. Each lock that you open is added to your character's inventory and can later be placed on the security board to remove the matching icons from the code. Once all the icons are cleared, the lab opens. But in order to open the locks in the first place, you'll need to collect equipment cards. Each equipment card also has those colored icons on its top left corner, so all equipment also doubles as a key that opens locks with the matching symbol, with you sometimes needing multiple equipment to open one locked door. This means that the general gameplay loop will have the survivors entering rooms, rolling dice to search for items, either succeeding in obtaining 1 or more new equipment cards, or failing and facing a consequence, then using the collected items to open locks, then rinse and repeat. And this is honestly where the first real issue comes in. This is just way too dependent on random chance to be the central means of progressing the game. They did include a rule that if more than one survivor is in the room while you're searching, you can roll an additional die for each one. This increases your odds of a successful search, but it also penalizes you by increasing the risk of punishment. Let me explain, or skip ahead a few minutes if you don't care. I won't judge. You see, the rules state for a search to be successful, you need to roll the success icon at least once. Any other icon rolled is considered a failure, and if more than one failure is rolled with no success in the same roll, you have to also roll this, the terror die. You'll learn to hate this. This determines what your punishment will be, and it can be anything from a few extra zombies spawning to an extra difficult boss monster spawning, or a fire breaking out that will spread across the mansion and make the game much harder. This means that you can only roll a critical failure if you're searching with at least 2 survivors, but your odds of success with only 1 survivor are pretty low, because each die has 2 successes on it, which adds up to a 1 in 3 chance of a success for each roll. I feel the need to repeat myself on this. This is way too dependent on random chance, and this is honestly a recurring theme throughout the game. Seriously, you live and die by the dice roll. You have to search to progress the game, so you have to either waste turns doing single searches or risk brutal consequences for a higher chance of success, and even the severity of that punishment is based on a dice roll. But here's the thing, I fully acknowledge that random chance is a necessary part of tabletop gaming, and I even believe it adds an extra element of fun and unpredictability to certain games. The problem with Darker Darkest is that the margin for that randomness is a mile wide. To look at a good example of randomness in a game, let's look at Betrayal at House on the Hill. This game has you drawing random cards to determine events and rolling dice to determine damage or the outcome of certain events. But the difference here is that the randomness is always attached to something concrete. When you draw an omen card in that game, the randomness comes from which card you get and how it immediately affects your character or the game state. But either way, you're still getting an omen card and progressing the game. And the only time a bad die roll is truly screwing you over is late game when you're at low health and it thematically makes sense for that to happen. Up until then, the difference between a good roll and a bad roll is usually just a couple points of damage or ending up in a slightly different room from where you wanted to be. The same is not true for Darker Darkest. The punishment for bad die rolls is often just way too punishing, screwing over your playthrough within the first few turns by dealing a massive amount of damage to your character, giving you the zombie virus, which cripples your character's ability for the rest of the game, or spawning back-to-back hordes of zombies that you have no hope of overcoming. And the worst part is, you may not even be progressing the game as these things happen. We had multiple games where we attempted to search a room at the beginning, and the consequence of doing so forced us to just scrap the run and start over. Or there were games where we lasted for a while, but failed too many search rolls, and by the time we started actually obtaining items, the darkness counter had already progressed so far that there was no time for us to win before the timer ran out. Now, let's talk a bit about the group up mechanic I mentioned earlier, as I feel it's a good example of the game's tendency to have ambitious ideas that are poorly executed. Basically, each player has a certain number of action points determined by their survivor's stats and reduced based on how much damage they've taken. These action points are represented by colored cubes that are placed on their survivor board in these squares and moved to the adjacent square as actions are taken. The multi-tracker also has squares that are used to track when a hero has finished their actions that turn, where you move their cube to the square below when they're out. So you're probably thinking, that makes sense. One box for each player, so each player gets to take their actions and track it individually. Wrong! At the start of a turn, all players that are in the same room place their squares in the same box. These players are now grouped up for that turn, which means they're more or less a single unit. And here's the really crazy part. The assigned player groups have to take their turns going from left to right across the board, and the next group doesn't get to move until the previous group is done. Players within a group can alternate and take actions in any order they want, but any players in a different group have to wait their turn. This means you have to be super strategic about how you end your turn, because if you and another player end in separate rooms, you can't cooperate as effectively on the next turn. Not only does this not thematically make sense, it really hinders this game as a cooperative experience. And I can see what the developers were going for. It forces the players to be more strategic about how they spread out and explore, and to strategize with what order the team should go in on a specific turn, but it really doesn't end up adding much to the game. All it really does is discourage exploration and slow down the game, because you always feel the need to save an action point to regroup with your teammates and never stray too far. Otherwise, you can end up in a situation where you're being mowed down by a horde of zombies and your buddy just has to sit and watch from the other room because he started his turn in the foyer instead of the bathroom one space over, and it's understandably a pretty ridiculous and frustrating experience. After hearing all that, you probably think I don't have anything nice to say about this game, but believe it or not, I do have a few things that I feel are positives for this game that I'll mention now before I wrap up the review. First of all, I like the way the combat system works. They have a system for the weapons where each one comes with a set amount of ammo represented by black cubes. During combat, you can spend one of these cubes to add extra damage or range to your attack, and it makes for some really thrilling and satisfying combat, where you're balancing resource management with mowing down zombies as efficiently as possible. Combat is also a time where I actually like the dice system. When making an attack, you roll up to 4 dice depending on what equipment and abilities you currently have. While not every side of the die represents a hit, most of the sides represent something that's at least a favorable outcome that adds some extra flavor to combat. This side represents a retreat, and rolling this in combat allows you to move your character to another space to add some fun variety to your fights. This side represents knockback, which allows you to push a zombie to an adjacent space to break up the horde a bit. This side represents aiming, and increases the range of a gun attack by 1, allowing you to take out zombies further away. And finally, this side is the fail side. This one cancels out any of the other symbols that were rolled, but the player is allowed to choose which one, so it doesn't necessarily cripple your turn. And if you roll 2 fails, you can even use 1 fail to cancel out another and keep your other rolls. Damage from zombie attacks are also determined by dice rolls, but you can choose to distribute the damage between any heroes in the room, allowing for some extra strategizing and giving a sense of one character jumping in front of another to take a hit for them. Every now and then, you do get screwed and roll something unusable, but this system has created some truly thrilling encounters where my brother and I were fighting back to back and mowing down hordes of zombies, or just struggling to make a retreat without losing too much health. This is definitely where most of our enjoyment out of the game came from. And another thing I like, the XP and ability system. Every zombie killed and lock opened nets you an XP point, and these points can be cashed in to unlock new abilities. And these abilities really create a sense of progression and powering up your character. My favorite ability is this one. It allows you to count aim counters as hits during combat, greatly increasing your odds of wiping out a horde. This also incentivizes you to hunt down the zombies instead of just avoiding them. I also like part of how the zombie spawning system works. Let me explain. At the start of every turn, you roll 2 dice to determine which room in the house they spawn in. You roll a d4 to determine the row, and a d6 to determine the column. You then place a random zombie tile on the space indicated. The fun part is, the tile isn't revealed until a hero comes in range of it. Until then, it sits out of sight like a looming threat that you'll need to confront later, and it adds a fun bit of mystery to it. Will this be a one single zombie to confront, or will it be a horde of 6 that you'll have to run from? It adds a fun sense of building tension, and also adds an additional incentive to track down zombies and thin the hordes to keep them from piling up and becoming unmanageable. The problem, though, is that there are only 5 columns to the map, but you're rolling a d6. This means if you roll a 6, the zombies instead spawn on a space directly adjacent to the player, and when that happens, the zombies immediately become active and attack you the next time you move and alert them. Now, that might not be such a big issue on its own. How often do you really roll a 6? But this is also what you do if the room rolled is inaccessible due to either being locked or destroyed by fire. This means that both early game when most of the rooms are locked and late game when rooms are destroyed by fire, you're going to be rolling a lot of rooms that the zombies can't spawn in and spawning them right on top of you instead. This led to a lot of rounds where tons of zombies would spawn on top of us, we'd spend our entire turn thinning the herd so we could escape, but then more zombies would immediately spawn on top of us the next turn, and we just got stuck in an unwinnable loop. So, I like the zombie spawning system in concept, but it's yet another thing that was botched in the execution. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I think this game could be improved quite a bit by adding some house rules. I even made a list of the rule changes that I would recommend making, but I won't go over the full list here as it's pretty extensive. You can find it in the description if you're interested. These rule changes will probably not address all of the game's issues or even make it a good game, but I feel they help to address some of the biggest issues the game has and make it at least more fair. Please note, though, that these rules were developed after playing it specifically with 2 players, so they may balance differently in a 3 to 5 player game. Either way, feel free to use these at your discretion, and I seriously encourage you to come up with your own rule changes as well if you decide to play this game. So, that pretty much sums up my thoughts on the game. I like what the developers are going for, and there is some genuine fun to be had in some of the scenarios this game creates, but the experience is just too fragile and unforgiving. You can spend the entire game strategizing and planning carefully, then one bad turn just ruins everything. And it never feels like it was your fault, like you could have done something different to change the outcome. It always feels the game just decided it was time for you to lose, and that was the end of it. But there you have it, Dark Darker Darkest, a confusingly named game with some confusing design choices. And now, I'd like to take a minute to talk a little more about my personal experience playing this game with my brother, because I feel there's something to learn from it. The night we brought the game back to the house we were staying in, we spent hours learning the rules and playing game after game. Pretty immediately, something didn't feel right. We found ourselves asking questions about the rules that easy answers couldn't be found for in the rulebook. And then, even once we were pretty sure we were playing it right, we realized we weren't having much fun. We'd get a game going and it would suddenly end after one turn of bad rolls, and we'd begrudgingly begin setting up for another attempt, determined to find some value out of the money my brother had spent on it. Then, he gave up. He admitted that the game was terrible and he had wasted his money. But meanwhile, I was very happy with my choice in game, as Unstable Unicorns turned out to be the fun, simple game that was promised, and my parents even enjoyed playing it with us. But the experience with Dark Darker Darkest kept eating at me, so I did something unexpected. I stayed up late that night, writing some of the rule changes that I shared with you just a few minutes ago. The next morning, I excitedly shared them with my brother, and we went to work playtesting the new rules. We found they definitely helped, but there were still some glaring issues. So I went back to writing, then to playtesting, and so on and so forth. But what I found was that our experience had suddenly changed. We were no longer thinking about how we had been ripped off or how broken the game was. Instead, we were thinking about how we could improve it. It suddenly became a whole new challenge to overcome, a blank slate for us to make the game we wanted to play. And in hindsight, I think that was way more valuable than the safe but fun experience we had with Unstable Unicorns. So, at the end of the week when it was time to go home, I bought Dark Darker Darkest from my brother, paying him back the full amount he had paid for it. While he had been ripped off, I found I had been pleasantly surprised by how the game had sparked my creativity, and with the bonding experience we'd had over trying to fix it. And to me, that was well worth the $50 asking price. So, maybe there's something to be said for avoiding the safe option, for trying something new on a whim and just making the best of the outcome, regardless of what happens. Or maybe I'm just trying to justify spending $50 on this crap.